Hey there. Welcome back to Reddit Views, the best channel for cheating stories. Like and subscribe to the channel for more spicy stories and drop a comment for a chance to have your comment featured. Now, let's get into today's story video.
My 28-year-old relationship with a 16-year-old woman and what I learned from it. First and foremost, I apologize for my English. I am not a native speaker, so any expressions that appear to be of may be due to a lack of vocabulary, as well as spelling problems. In my previous piece, I told the account of something that happened to a friend of mine. And now it's my turn to share my personal story with you. I need to go back a long time to explain my reactions to you all. I was a late bloomer. My mother was 39 years old and my father was 40 years old when I was born. Soon after, my father was diagnosed with silicosis, a professional disease. He had to quit working when I was about 4, and I spent my youth witnessing my father deteriorate from a giant of a man to a mere shadow of himself. At the age of 12, I had my father in cardiac arrest and hammered his chest to keep him breathing until medical help arrived. He died of the disease when I was 20, but I spent my entire life seeing the person I loved the most in this world deteriorate till his death. Add to that the fact that we lived in a very isolated location, and I practically grew up almost alone in a house filled with literature. I read Chariots of the when I was 8 and War and Peace by 10, rationalizing my sentiments every single day. So it's safe to say that this influenced my attitude and instilled in me a strong belief that nothing in life is permanent. I'm not afraid to admit that, while my father's death was one of the most traumatic events in my life, it also brought a sense of comfort. His agony was over. I always looked older than I was. Funny, presently I look much younger than I am or feel, so I had a lot of generally with girls a little older than me, but I never really wanted a girlfriend or any other type of connection other than friendships. But not long after my father died, I began seeing a great girl. We are still close to this day. The first 2 years of our relationship were fantastic, but then she moved to study in a city about 200 miles away, and we went through a period where we only saw each other every 2 weeks. She ended up isolating herself in there, and had a persistent depression at the conclusion of her term. She refused treatment and, even though she returned permanently, our relationship was never healthy again, becoming more of a codependency, with me and her family trying everything to no avail and her illness worsening. To top it all off, I lost my work due to health concerns. I ended up sliding into a depression myself. My already low self-esteem sank even further. I gained roughly 50 pounds, and I basically looked like a homeless person. I felt imprisoned and worried about what she would do if I broke up with her. But one day, for reasons I still don't understand, something clicked deep within me. I ended things with her, which ultimately led her to get medical care, and life went on for both of us. So, at the time, I had a new job, was trying to rediscover myself, and was not seeking for anything in the way of a relationship because I felt I was broken goods. H was a beautiful, sophisticated woman who worked in the same department as me. She was divorced, but she was living with a very affluent and successful man. She was often bragging about the jet-set parties she attended, not to brag, but because all of her co-workers, all women, I was the only man on that floor, were curious. And she was lovely and utterly out of my league, a 28-year-old overweight headbanger who played other people's music at bars on the weekends to supplement her income. We became unlikely pals. I was the only guy who knew anything about computers, and she asked if I could help her and her husband design a logo for a new business they were starting. I agreed to do it, and we began spending time together, even going to her house to handle internet problems and other issues with their personal computer. We had lunch together frequently because we worked in the same place, and our friendship evolved. And I became increasingly attracted to her, and I noticed that she was feeling the same way. But I didn't even want to think about it. She was with someone, and I knew the person. But the sensation was there. She had 2 children. The elder lived with her father, so I rarely saw her, but her youngest lived with her, was an early teen at the time, and she took a fancy to me. Perhaps because I treated her as an adult rather than a child. My friendship with H grew stronger, and about 6 months into it all, she began confiding in me. Even while her relationship appeared to be ideal on the surface, things were not so pleasant beneath the surface. I listened to a number of things that, simply, repulsed me, but even though I was there, I made a conscious decision not to offer any advice because I didn't believe it was my position to do so. I offered a shoulder and a listening ear where she could express her concerns, but I never encouraged or advised her. Especially because it felt as if electricity was going from one of our eyes to the other every time our eyes locked. I could feel the tension between us rising, but I told myself that there was no way a woman like her would even consider being a guy like me, therefore it was all in my brain. And I gradually began to distance myself from her. Even if she had feelings for me, she was already in a relationship, and I was not going to be that guy. And it was at this time that things in their relationship really began to deteriorate, and she began looking for a house she could afford and separated from him. She asked for my assistance with the move, which I gladly provided, and a week later, after she had set the house in order, she invited me to dinner, and I ended up spending the night. We agreed to have a relationship 2 weeks later, after some lengthy discussions. We told her daughter, who was overjoyed with the news, that everything seemed to be going well, and that for the first time in my life, I wasn't feeling just fleeting moments of happiness, but that I was happy, and this was a new feeling for me. But my feelings that nothing is permanent remained. That was my method of justifying everything around me. And both of those feelings warned me that it was unlikely that this would last, especially given our age gap. I was 28 and she was 44. We began to hunt for a place to live as a family, as the place where she moved in had only one bedroom, one living room, a little kitchen, and an even tinier WC. The relationship was blossoming and everything looked to be going well, but I began to observe how she tried to persuade me to change. Some aspects of my appearance, such as the way I dressed, and the fact that I needed to lose weight, I felt were completely acceptable, even welcomed. But in other news, she appeared to be trying to rebuild me to her standards, rather than embracing me for who I was. We took a vacation together 6 months later. We decided to just jump in the car and go wherever we wanted to spend the night. But the first night, we went to another city where she had a girlfriend, and we ended up seeing the friend and spent the night at her house since she wouldn't let us stay in a hotel. Nothing happened here, but this friend will be useful later on. We'll refer to her as E. She worked 2 jobs, during the day as a secretary, at night as a waitress in a pub, and as a volunteer firefighter. She was a difficult lady. But the entire time we were with her, she was lamenting about how difficult it was to find a boyfriend. Mind you, this friend was my girlfriend's age, so mid-40s. We left that city and spent the next week exploring and having fun, and on the last night, before we returned to her place, after a long and very torrid night while we were smoking on the balcony of the hotel room we were staying in, she asks me, "Where do you think this relationship is heading?" And all the old stuff I had inside just surfaced. We ended up having a decent conversation, but I thought something wasn't quite right from the start. After we talked, she went to bed, and I ended up spending the night sitting on a chair on the balcony, smoking and pondering. I knew she loved me, and I loved her, but the disparities between us, the gap between who I was and who she wanted I was, were beginning to show. The next day, we returned to her house, and the universe seemed to realign once more. It was a fantastic day. The next day, her younger sister returned from her father's house, and he arrived with her daughter to spend a week at her place. I was merely going to sit out that night before heading home and back to work. As soon as he arrived, she inquired about the location of the fire station. She explained that it was customary for volunteer firefighters to go to the fire station and leave their contact information in case anything was required. She went into the fire station and returned having met one of the guys there, with his phone number and an invitation to a nightclub. We all agreed to go, despite the fact that it's not exactly my type of place. The firefighter arrived late at night, accompanied by another man. I thought it was strange and wanted to go right away, but I eventually agreed because her daughter urged me to. So off we went. The dancing club had an open space at the rear with a swimming pool and a beautiful view of the ocean, so I spent the night there with her kid, simply talking and laughing. She turned to me at one point and questioned, "You really love my mother, don't you?" I just smiled and responded, "Yes." She simply hugged me and whispered, "Good." Her mother, E, and the tow firefighters were constantly on the dance floor. I went to check on them after about 2 hours of boredom and saw them. And the dancing was pretty edgy. Let's just say I wasn't pleased with what I witnessed. We walked to her house after we left the club. He was talking to the first guy she met, H was chatting to the second guy who came along, and I was talking to her kid in the back. That's when the guy who was chatting to H asked her, subtly but not so subtly that I didn't notice, what was up with me, and her response was, "Oh, he's just a close friend." We arrived at her place, the guys left, and we all went to bed. She slept in the living room with me, but there was no that night. I left the following morning. We used to converse on the phone every day, and text messages were a daily occurrence between us. On that day, in the evening, I attempted to call, but there was no answer, and no call back. The next day, the same thing happened. Throughout the week, she either didn't answer, answered and said she couldn't talk, and would call me later, or her daughter answered and said her mother was already asleep. And I finally got it. So I simply stopped calling after a week. As difficult as it was, I knew there was no purpose in pursuing a relationship with someone who clearly had reservations about being with me. And I felt genuinely sorry, but my entire life appeared to have been preparing me for things like this. I just withdrew fully, put all those feelings in a drawer, closed it, and told myself that everything is as it should be. I couldn't stop the sadness, but I could regulate my fury and not let it control me. The notion of losing her tortured me, but my reasonable side would tell me, how can you lose something that was never yours? Because, in reality, no one belongs to anyone. And forcing someone to be with you is a horrible idea. All that remains is anger, misery, depression, and resentment. I had disbanded my cover band because I was considering moving, but when I reconnected with my bandmates, the band was re-established with a new name and lineup, and we began preparing a playlist, booking performances, and rehearsing. And then, 1 month after we had last seen each other, after 3 weeks of no contact, she called. It was a Friday, and she asked if I wanted to come over to her place for supper. She stated that she was alone because her daughter had returned to her father for a few more days. I informed her. I was busy that day, and she was surprised, but the invitation remained valid for the next day, even though I informed her I wouldn't be there for dinner, but we could get a drink afterward. So, about 9:30 p.m. On that Saturday, I arrived to her house. She came in almost naked, we hugged, and as she went for a kiss, I merely turned my face and gave her my cheek. She was extremely shaken as a result of this. I waited in her living room while she dressed, and then we proceeded to a bar near her house that we had never been to before. On the way there, she asked if I liked her dress, and I complimented her. She explained that she knew I liked seeing her in that dress, therefore she was wearing it. I remained silent about the subject. We arrived at the bar, sat down, and a man came over to take our orders, and they addressed each other by first name. Then I looked around, and I noticed that I was the focus of attention. "There has to be something wrong with me today," I said to her. "Why?" "Well, it appears that everyone is staring at me." "Don't worry about it," she exclaimed. But the fact was that everyone there seemed to know her, especially the guys, and I could tell by the way they looked at her what they were thinking. We arrived back at her door around 11 p.m. "Would you like to come up?" she inquired. "No, I'll simply get started." "I'd really appreciate it if you could come up." "I believe you, but that will not happen." "Why?" "Because you made your decisions and compelled me to make mine." "What exactly do you mean? Did you have a good time with the firefighter?" "He wasn't the lay you expected him to be, or maybe he was, but you were just a toy." "What are you on about?" "He's the one you slept with." "I never slept with him." I couldn't stop laughing. "You don't have to lie to me, I'm simply a good buddy, remember?" she blushed. "Since you told him that, why wouldn't he pursue you? And you kept E around for another week, a week in which you didn't even answer the phone. Were you really that bad? Or did you just not want to ruin your and E's fun?" She had just begun to cry. "Don't be that way. I'm not upset with you. To tell the truth, I'm thankful. I am grateful for everything you have given me, for the time we spent together, for instilling something in me that was never truly present, my self-esteem. But the moment you said that, I knew you were going to him, and I was simply getting in the way. And I'm not even going to mention the pub where we were. How many did you have with men from that group? Did you get it out of your system and want something more consistent now? I'm not your boyfriend, to be sure. I guess I was never truly me. I was just a fugitive FWB. And I know I'm not the last bottle of water in the desert, and I can't physically compare to them, but there must be something in me that made you call me back after a month. That maybe I'm not so awful after all. But we've finished. I'll always be your buddy, I'll always love you, and if you ever need anything, just give me a call, but otherwise, we're done. I gave her a hug and a kiss on the cheek, sobbed as I watched her enter the building, grabbed my car keys and drove away. She contacted me about an hour later, as I was driving home. I pulled over to the side of the road to answer the phone, and as soon as I did, I could only hear her sobbing and yelling, I'm sorry, please come back, I love you, I don't want to lose you. And there, right there, it was as though all the pain erupted at the same time. It seemed like someone was ripping me apart, as if my head had finally succumbed and my emotions had free run over me, and I had entirely lost control. Say anything, please, was all she could say for a few minutes, as I collected myself in silence, despite the fact that my world was collapsing around me. You have never loved me. You were enthralled by the prospect of what you imagined you could make of me. However, I am not the person you were looking for, therefore you are now free to locate someone who is more in accordance with your preferences. I adore you and would sacrifice my life for you, but I will not put up with betrayal and disrespect. I'm not the kind of kid you can wrap your finger around. I don't exist solely to meet your demands and requirements. We're done, we're finished, and there's no turning back. And then, before I truly broke apart, I got out of the car, yelled, and the mobile phone rang again, and it was her, so I crushed it on the floor. Then I got back in the car, took some time to compose myself, and finally drove home for a sleepless night. 5 months later, an angel entered my life, and we've been together for the last 20 years, married for 15 years, and have a wonderful daughter who is the light of my life. Never stopped being her friend till her unexpected death from a brain tumor 10 years ago. She never stopped expressing her feelings for me, and the final time we spoke, she told me I was her greatest regret. I told her I had no regrets and was grateful for what we had. Even to this day, her daughter adores me. So, why tell it if it isn't a wonderful story? I see a lot of folks here attempting to hold on to an illusion. I've noticed a lot of debate about alpha and beta males. So, I'm not an alpha, because I don't impose myself on anyone, and I'm not a beta, because I don't kneel down to anyone, so I'm not sure what I am or if there is some idiotic categorization for me. All I can say is that if you love someone, as Sting would say, you must set them free. Then their actions will reveal if they want to be with you or not. Because if they say they do, but their actions do not offer you the respect you deserve, you are doomed to sorrow and misery, or blissful ignorance. Forcing someone to be by your side is counterproductive, and will only result in animosity. That is why so many people discuss the 180. Sometimes you only realize what you've lost after it's gone. And, so many times, once you get into that 180 and start to look at things coldly, do you really want that person in your life? Or is it simply your pride at having lost something that was never truly yours to begin with? Peace.